Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight for the speaker sessions. My name is Erica Barker. I'm the curatorial manager here at the Birthplace of Country Music Museum. My colleague Tony Doman is working our technology tonight. And we are very excited to be hosting my former professor, Dr. Angela Keaton. I am particularly honored to be introducing her tonight. And I'll go ahead and get started then. So tonight's speaker, as I said, is my former professor, so I'm particularly honored to be introducing her tonight. But Angela Keaton is a professor of history at Tusculum's Department of History and Museum Studies. She joined the department in 2006 after earning her PhD from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Dr. Keaton has published work focused on both history and pedagogy. Her research investigates the many ways Americans encountered firearms in the post-World War II era, a golden age of gun use that ended abruptly in the 1960s due to a host of political, cultural, and social factors. Her article, Backyard Desperados, American Attitudes Concerning Toy Guns in the Cold War Era, published in the Journal of American Culture, earned the Carl Bode Award for the best article published in that journal in 2010. Her most recent article about hunting and gun culture will be included in Red Reckoning, A New History of the Cold War and the Transformation of American Life, LSU Press. She has served in a variety of leadership positions at Tusculum and earned the Tusculum Excellence in Teaching and Campus Leadership Award in 2009 and 2018, in addition to being awarded the National Living Alumni Faculty Award in 2018. She teaches American history as well as classes on historical research, gender, Asia, and the contemporary Middle East. She also enjoys sharing history with the public, giving numerous lectures such as this one, and workshops each year ranging in subject matter from material culture to the history of food. So welcome, Dr. Keaton. We are very glad to have you with us tonight.
Thank you, Erica, for that wonderful introduction. Erica is a very distinguished alumni. I'm thrilled to be here. So thank you to her and the museum for the invitation. I have several former students in the audience, so I'm sure that they'll behave.
Thank you.
Probably not. I can't do anything to them at this point. And thank you to you all for coming out on a beautiful July evening to listen to me talk about myths about Appalachian history. So before we dive into the myths, it's probably best that we define, or at least attempt to define, what Appalachia is. How does one define Appalachia? Most people might start with locating it on a map. And when I teach Appalachian history, that's where I start. First, I give students just a map like this, and I give them some colored pencils and ask them to color in where they think Appalachia is. They kind of struggle with that, so then I give them a map with the political boundaries on it. And we try this one. That doesn't help them either. In fact, they're just more frustrated with me, which is all part of my plan. And then I give them one that has the topographical features with the political borders. And at this point, the students that haven't walked out of the classroom are very frustrated. So I give them a bit of relief and let them look at how the federal government defines Appalachia. This is the ARC map, the Appalachian Regional Commission. It's the official federal definition of Appalachia. And as you can guess, they are perplexed. The questions immediately emerge as to why Mississippi, parts of that are included in Appalachia, and parts of New York. They're perplexed by that. So then we start to move away from the discussion of, well, if we have a hard time defining Appalachia geographically, maybe we should talk about how we define it culturally. And I found this online. You know, I'm from Hollerland, Southern West Virginia, in the very dark green. This is how some people view Appalachian culture. The Great Valley country, interior ridgelines, Hollerland, Pittsburghia. Of course, this isn't serious. Or do we define? Yeah, this is a serious, crucial question here. Is Appalachian do we distinguish it between the land of no grits or grits? Unfortunately, I grew up with no grits. We had to wait till we went on vacation down here to get grits. Or do we define it where people say y'all or where they say youans? Again, I'm from y'all country. I hadn't heard youans until I moved here. So, we have these discussions. Do we define Appalachia as where people put sugar in their cornbread, where they eat biscuits instead of toast? And students still struggle with trying to define Appalachia. And then we also talk about, I found this map online as well, where someone had attempted to say, okay, well, if the federal government defines Appalachia with the blue area outlined there, then really maybe culturally Appalachia is the gray area. And again, none of this is exact. So we start the first day of class, the students being confused and frustrated. And they're asking, how can we study something when we don't even know what or where it is? How can we study something that doesn't seem to exist? And so we spend the next 15 weeks trying to figure out what that means. And in case you're wondering, in week 15, we never do come up with a good definition or a map with that answered. But Appalachia does exist. It hasn't always existed, though. The concept of Appalachia itself is a rather new one, historically speaking. The notion that there was a distinct place with distinct people was manufactured, largely as the result of the many myths that began to emerge about the region and its people, especially in the late 19th century. From the beginning of white settlement, there have been misconceptions about the region that later became known as Appalachia. In the late 18th century, Federalists in particular waged smear campaigns against settlers, while almost a century later, critics continued to make exaggerated claims about Appalachians. By the early 20th century, the rhetoric had solidified into terrible stereotypes. As a result, by the early 20th century, in the minds of most Americans and some Appalachians, Appalachia had become a distinct, isolated region, populated exclusively by impoverished, backward descendants of Scots-Irish pioneers. Unfortunately, these misperceptions have had negative real-life consequences for Appalachia. So tonight, we're just going to focus on 4 of these misperceptions. And I want to stress these are myths. I'm not saying these define Appalachia in any way. The first myth is that Appalachia has always been poor. Myth number 2 is Appalachians have always been backward and isolated. Myth number 3 is that Appalachia has always been white. And myth number 4, Appalachians have always been a problem. So let's begin with myth number 1. Appalachians have always been poor. As of 1840, Southern Appalachia figured as a relatively prosperous region of the U.S., on par with any other frontier area, thanks to its abundance of resources. We can see some of these key resources here, and I've got this chart here to see how much money you could make with various skins of animals in the mid-19th century. Fur was one of the early sources of income in Appalachia. Until about 1830, hunting for fur was very popular. That trade in fur virtually disappeared by 1830, however, because fur-bearing animals grew scarce. Ginseng was another attractive resource. Some of Appalachia's earliest white settlers sought the medicinal root coveted by Americans who traded with China. Settlers also earned a very easy subsistence and extra income with livestock. By 1754, the Shenandoah Valley had become well known for its cattle. Up to the Revolutionary War, the practice of fattening cattle on corn had become common along the Greenbrier River and also along the south branch of the Potomac River. In 1804, most of the cattle then reaching the markets of Washington, Alexandria, and Baltimore originated in the valleys of Eastern Virginia. Today, those would be the counties that border Virginia. They're actually in West Virginia. Later, the Kanawha River Valley became a major thoroughfare for stock drives eastward. In the mountains, hogs, not cattle, dominated livestock. Whereas a single cow required 15 acres of pine forest to survive during the winter, a hog could survive on much less and could be left to scrounge for mast, so that they became attractive to mountain dwellers. In 1826 alone, 60,000 hogs went east to market along the Kanawha Turnpike, 26,000 of them within the space of 2 months in the fall. The same scene could be witnessed in western North Carolina and East Tennessee. In 1827, the Buncombe Turnpike, largely following the French Broad River, reached completion from Greenville, Tennessee to Greenville, South Carolina. This new turnpike greatly facilitated livestock drives out of the mountains. Each autumn, an estimated 150,000 to 175,000 hogs traveled the turnpike. You can imagine the frustration of anybody else trying to use that turnpike. And this no doubt gave rise to the complaint of someone hogging the road. If you've ever wondered. During the early 19th century, settlers achieved large surpluses over and above what they needed for self-sufficiency, not just in hogs, but also in the production of grains. So what happened? When and why did Appalachia begin its descent into poverty? We see an economic decline, although not a precipitous drop, into poverty in the mid-19th century as population increased and the surpluses of farm goods dwindled. When the best land and the widest valleys had been occupied by this growing population, settlers had to move. They moved to marginal land in the narrowest hollows. It's really hard for me to say hollows, by the way. I prefer to say hollers. And then up onto steep hillsides. All the while, the population continued to increase. During the third quarter of the 19th century, from about 1850 to 1875, food production then fell drastically throughout Appalachia, particularly in the area called Newer Appalachia. Note that the population in Newer Appalachia was also rapidly increasing, exacerbating the decline of farm products. There, the population grew dramatically. You can see there it grew 62% in the 1840s and continued a dramatic growth through the 1870s. This is a lot of pressure even on good land. But in this case, land suitable for farming was decreasing. Gone too were the days when ginseng covered the hills in abundance and when settlers could hunt for fur. Gone also were the decades when the plateau in particular had offered an easy livelihood with livestock. The picture that emerges from all of these figures is not one of complete impoverishment, but of belt tightening. So still we see that Appalachia wasn't necessarily plunged into poverty. It's important to note, though, that the economic decline did reduce living standards for many of the region's people, softening them up, as it turned out, for later industrial exploitation. If the new Appalachians wished to stay in place, they had to find new economic arrangements. As a result, as the 19th century ended, these Appalachians turned to wage labor in extractive industries to supplement their farming. They were still dependent on the land, but now it was via resource extraction rather than just farming. To demonstrate that fact, many more Appalachians started mining coal. By 1880, several thousand were also cutting timber for wages, at least on an occasional basis, especially in East Tennessee. Overall, Appalachia at this point was not poor, but poverty was lurking around the corner as outsiders started to exert more and more control over the natural resources that more and more Appalachians were coming to depend on. Thus, it was not until the late 19th century that the conditions for poverty began to materialize. Despite the historical record to the contrary, the myth of poverty has been one of the most dominant misperceptions about Appalachia. It's probably only superseded by our next myth. The Appalachians have always been backward and isolated. Beginning in the late 19th century, magazines began to employ what they called local color writers. These contributors acted as part amateur anthropologists, part tourists, and part reporters. They would visit exotic or interesting places and present their findings to readers. But while these reports were presented under the guise of being educational, as what they called documentary sketches by neutral observers, they were actually just sensationalized accounts intended to entertain rather than inform audiences. Quickly, the local and local color became the southern mountain region of the US. The sketches produced by these writers would radically and irrevocably shape perceptions of the region. And what emerges from these local color writings are these two simultaneous notions of Appalachians. Either they were presented as behind the rest of the country, less evolved. They were presented as being primitive, in need of modernization. These writings also presented Appalachians as kind of this reservoir of untainted American culture, the last island of pure Americanness that hadn't been tainted by all of the immigrants flooding into the country. And regardless of which portrayal appeared in these writings, they still both presented Appalachians as backward, either way. On the one hand, the environment, the mountains, the raging rivers, and the deep hollows were presented as barriers that had isolated and thus preserved the best of Anglo-Saxon and early American culture, brought to the frontier by white settlers. At the same time, some accounts presented the isolation as a force that had halted progress. In short, the people in Appalachia were so isolated from civilization that they had reverted to a primitive, almost feral state. Collectively, what emerged from these accounts was the prototype of the mountaineer, or the hillbilly, which came to stand in for all residents of the Southern Mountains. And just as the people of the region were redefined, the region itself was redefined as a distinct, homogeneous area known as Appalachia. Thus, a vast, sprawling, geographically diverse area was reduced to and reformulated as a region restricted to its most prominent mountain ranges. And while the notion of a discrete geographic entity came into being, so did a unique characterization of its people. And that characterization was not kind. So I assign a lot of these local color readings to students in this class, and they work together in teams, and I have them come back after reading their magazine and newspaper articles from the late 1800s, early 1900s. And I ask them to write down, what are the words that you see repeated the most in your reading assignments? And then I feed those into a computer program to make a word cloud. And the way this works is, maybe you've probably used these or seen these before. The more a word is entered, the more it appears in these writings, the bigger it gets in the word cloud. So the bigger the word is here, the more it has appeared in these local color writings. So primitive, isolated and backward are the biggest ones, of course. Poor, cabin, dirty, some of the little tiny ones. Immoral is a real little one up there. Uneducated, the word dogs. I don't know if you can see it, but it's really tiny up there. I also asked them to write down some quotes that stand out to them from these local color writings. So I've got a selection of those here, and I emphasize these are quotes, not my words. To the average mountaineer, the earth was still flat and had 4 corners. Stories of votes still being cast for Andrew Jackson are not exaggerated. These are articles from late 1800s, early 1900s. Brutally savage fights are still common, in which the combatants strike, kick, bite, and gouge. One still finds among the Appalachians a belief in signs, omens, and the practice of witchcraft. Few can read, write, and cipher. The moral relations of the sexes are hardly more sacred than among lower animals. Many homes do not even have a comb for the hair. And perhaps the most damning and maybe the most curious allegation, if you're wearing pearls and they'll prepare to clutch them, very few of them wear underwear. Now, along with these literary gems were unflattering visual representations of the Appalachian. This particular one captures many of the basic elements, the facial expressions, and kind of surly, bare feet, the scruffy beard, suspenders and or overalls, a shapeless felt hat, and of course, a moonshine jug or a flask. And yes, of course, it's got to have a long-barreled rifle. You would also see characterizations of Appalachians that noted certain characteristics of the men and the women. The women, wow, it's very nice. So this is pulled from this article that was published in June of 1886, but this is fairly representative of characterizations of Appalachians throughout this time period. Initially, the protagonists in these sketches were referred to as mountaineers, again, reinforcing the idea that Appalachia was a region of just mountains. But by the early 20th century, the term hillbilly also came into vogue. The first printed use of the term appeared in the New York Journal in 1900, when an anonymous reporter claimed that a hillbilly is a free and untrammeled white citizen who lives in the hills, has no means to speak of, dresses as he can, talks as he pleases, drinks whiskey when he gets it, and fires off his revolver as the fancy takes him. Media coverage of feuds also played into fueling these stereotypes about Appalachians. One newspaper reported that, quote, "The savages who inhabit this region lie in wait and shoot their enemies in the back. One can hardly believe that any part of the United States is cursed with people so lawless and degraded." And unfortunately, in pop culture, that's really stuck. Really famous Bugs Bunny cartoon here, Hillbilly Hair. I don't know if anyone's ever seen that before. It's on YouTube if you want to watch it. But Bugs Bunny of course, he takes a wrong turn in Albuquerque and he stumbles upon these hillbillies who are fighting with each other. And it's not just they're fighting with each other. He takes advantage of their ignorance and gets them to do a square dance where they just beat the daylights out of each other. And then this cartoon here is from the 1980s. So the stereotypes persisted well over 100 years. But the hillbillies, as it turned out, were malleable. In addition to providing this type of entertainment, they could also serve another purpose: calming fears about the perceived dangers of immigration. Chief among those fears was that waves of immigrants threatened to wash away white Anglo-Saxon culture. In the hands of some writers, the supposed isolation of the mountaineers had protected them from the degrading aspects of civilization. In short, mountain residents were cast as the last reservoir of untainted, pure, white Anglo-Saxon culture. As one writer explained, quote, "The world around them has moved forward, but they have stood still." John Fox, a very popular local color writer, asserted that, quote, "The hills have cut Appalachia off from the mainstream and have held it stagnant." Another popular article explained to readers that the mountaineers live, quote, "today as their forefathers lived before them 100 years ago, hearing little of the outside world and caring nothing for it." But that isolation could be beneficial. As a literary journal noted, Appalachians, quote, "are an important offset to the old world outcast," i.e. immigrants, "whom we have welcomed to our shores." But if improperly managed, this isolation could have dangerous consequences. Poverty, backwardness, and violence, warned one article, spring from the remote and insulated life of these people. How then could a balance be found between preserving this pool of whiteness while also preventing it from becoming a cesspool of backwardness. Well, according to the Baltimore Sun, quote, "There are but two remedies for such a situation. They are education or extermination." With many of the individuals, the latter is the only remedy. Men and races alike, when they defy civilization, must die. The mountaineers, like the Red Indians, must learn this lesson. Likewise, the president of Berea College, William Goodell Frost, warned that, quote, "Ruthless change is knocking at the door of every mountain cabin. The jackals of civilization have already abused the confidence of many a highland home. The lumber, coal, and mineral wealth of the mountains is to be possessed. Commercialism can easily debauch a simple people. The question is whether the mountain people can be enlightened so that they can have a part in their own development, or whether they must give place to immigrants and melt away like so many Indians." Now, like Frost, many other reformers and educators urged that the mountaineers obtain enough education to navigate the forces of civilization they had so far evaded. At the turn of the 19th century, Appalachia had captured the imaginations of these reformers and writers, but its natural resources were gaining the attention of industrial capitalists as well. This group presented themselves first and foremost as reformers. They launched campaigns designed to paint mountaineers as backward and unhealthy, in need of the supposed advantages that civilization and these companies could bring. They built on the already established image of mountaineers as violent and uncivilized, and presented them as diseased, malnourished, sexually promiscuous, and degenerate. Now, for example, one coal company bought, published, and circulated at their own expense a series of pamphlets, and they were entitled "Stories of Kentucky Feuds," and this is one of those pamphlets. And they each sensationalized and fictionalized Appalachian violence. The pamphlets helped coal company executives paint Appalachians as irrational, ignorant, and in need of saving. Conveniently, that salvation would come in the form of jobs and guidance provided by the coal company. Industries that were supposed to bring progress and modernity to isolated Appalachia instead often brought destruction to the people and the land, while reinforcing the myth of a perpetually poverty-stricken region inhabited by backward people. And what of these backward people? Who were they really beyond the stereotypes? Pop culture, the media, and even some academics, both in the 19th and in the 20th centuries, would have us believe that the most prominent factor unifying Appalachia was its whiteness. At its core, this third myth purports that Appalachia has always been white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. Contrary to the myth, Appalachia is not and has never been racially or ethnically homogeneous. It was not settled only by the Scots-Irish. People from a host of backgrounds have made Appalachia their home, both before and after the first white settlers arrived. When they entered the region in the mid-16th century, Europeans and Africans were only the most recent arrivals, and the land that had first been settled by Native Americans some 10,000 years previously. The Cherokee dominated southern Appalachia in the 16th century, but there were also Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Shawnees. Together, the population of these complex agricultural societies was 25,000 to 60,000 people. They combined the cultivation of corn, beans, squash, pumpkins, and tobacco with hunting, gathering, and fishing. They also maintained extensive trade networks. The earliest European expeditions into this native land were led by the Spanish, who referred to the region using the same term they used to refer to the natives, the Appalachians, who lived in modern-day Tallahassee, Florida. The first two Spanish expeditions also included African slaves. And although these expeditions made little immediate impact, they did mark the beginning of a steady intrusion of Europeans and Africans. Settlers that later followed brought a diverse ethnic and cultural mix to Appalachia. The English joined the Scots-Irish settlers, followed by the French, Welsh, and Dutch immigrants. German immigrants also flooded into Appalachia. By 1900, they formed the largest foreign-born contingent in every state in Appalachia except for two. And we can see most of them travel down the Great Wagon Road, Great Valley Road, stopping along the way and settling. And there's mountains of evidence for German immigration into Appalachia. The baptismal certificate, Pennsylvania. This is the page out of a church book. This is from just down the road in Greene County, Tennessee, that was maintained by a congregation there until 1830. And virtually every entry in the church book, Kirchen is German for church, is in German. So we see even, if you follow the names, you can see that the parents would enter a baptism or a marriage. And then even the second generation of people living in the community that attended the church, when they take over the church book, it's still in the German language. And see here, they've listed their communions on this page. Abendmahl is the German word for communion. Immigrants of African ancestry also continuously entered Appalachia. Most were brought as enslaved people, obtained from various West African kingdoms. The first census of 1790 indicates that more than 12,000 enslaved people had been transported across the mountains into Kentucky, and more than 3,000 into East Tennessee. Enslaved people performed agricultural labor, and they also worked in various industries. In central Appalachia, salt was among the earliest extractive industries established. As early as 1810, the salt licks there produced more salt than any other part of the US. Enslaved people provided most of the labor. At its peak in 1850, some 33 companies used more than 3,000 enslaved people in all phases of salt production. Census figures alone refute misconceptions about the racial purity of the Southern Appalachians. Slavery had infiltrated almost every Appalachian county by the mid-19th century. In 1860, the region as a whole included a Black populace, slave and free, of about 175,000 people. Just after the Civil War, urban areas such as Knoxville, Asheville, and Bristol saw a dramatic influx of Blacks from the South. So too did the coal fields of Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee, and West Virginia. The racial and ethnic diversity of Appalachia accelerated as industry accelerated. The owners of the mines, who were often absentee and located in large eastern cities, recruited foreign immigrants when local Appalachians could meet the demand for labor. Shipments of immigrants came from Italy, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Albania, and Greece. Typically, they traveled from New York to the coal camps of Appalachia without leaving their train. At the end of the trip, and this is what one person had to say about witnessing this migration. At the end of the trip, quote, utterly mystified and astounded, smelling of garlic and carrying immense bundles of old world shawls, dresses, petticoats, hats, and accordions, they arrived in the middle of a brand new Appalachian town. They were not welcome. They were greeted with, quote, jeers and hoots from crowds of mountaineers, to whom they were more often than not simply damn furrin' sons of bitches, end quote. Despite the verbal and sometimes physical abuse, immigrants continued to pour into Appalachia. For example, in West Virginia around 1870, when the immigration really starts, there were fewer than 1,000 foreign coal miners. By 1907, that number had risen to 16,000. And a few years later, by 1915, that number had rose to 32,000. In a 1909 report of the West Virginia coal fields, 18 different types of racial or ethnic origins were recorded in just 4 counties. And here's a sampling: white, black, Italian, Hungarian, Slavish, Polish, Russian, Greek, English, German, Romanian, Scottish, Austrian, Lithuanian, Swedish, Irish, Syrian, and unknown/other. Once established, and you can see that has not gone away. Some people have really held on to that culture. This is the festival that happens every year there. Once established in Appalachia, these immigrants did not jump in the proverbial melting pot, electing instead to hold on to many of their customs, social clubs, languages, and religions. As the little town in Himmlerville, Kentucky, was settled by immigrants from Hungary, and they published their own newspaper and their own textbooks for quite a while. So much for that melting pot. The Black population of the coal fields also grew dramatically. Southern West Virginia in particular lured African Americans in large numbers to its mines. In 1870, there were 3,200 African American miners. By 1910, that number had rose to 42,000. Thus, despite the best efforts to cast Appalachia as a pure, untainted reservoir of whiteness, the reality was quite different. A land haunted by perpetual poverty, inhabited by racially homogenous people, Appalachia, or at least these myths about it, loomed large in the imagination of Americans. And it's because of those myths that yet another one gained traction. Our final myth here, number 4, Appalachians have always been a problem. There's a little part of me that's a little proud of that. Certainly, Appalachia had problems. Every region of the U.S. has at some time faced challenges. But in this case, the Appalachians themselves were presented as a problem that needed to be solved. They're too barbaric, too isolated, too mean. They need reform. They stand in the way of their own progress, and so on. Even in early years, settlers in the region were seen as problematic and met with suspicion. President George Washington, troubled by these settlers, referred to the trans-Appalachians as, quote, our own white Indians, a reference to their problematic status on the edge of the new nation and their history of rebellion against authority. Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, described his home state of Pennsylvania as a sieve that retained the hardiest settlers of good character while leaking the unsavory dregs southward into the trans-Appalachian frontier. Other politicians agreed with Dr. Rush. One of our early Secretary of States wrote to a diplomat about the frontier lands, the settlers on the frontier lands, and he's specifically talking about people here on the frontier. They are least worthy, savage, and for want of industry, and because they won't work, they live miserably. Social commentators of the same period didn't have anything better to say. Setting their pens in motion, they created the image of, quote, the white savage, a ruthless brawler and eye gouger, dwelling in a dingy log cabin with yelping dogs at his heels, a haggard wife, and a mongrel brood of brown and yellow brats to complete the sorry scene. And that is a direct quote from a late 18th century newspaper. For the first few decades of the United States' existence then, settlers in the trans-Appalachian region, or as it was called at the time, the backcountry, were viewed as a problem. Their loyalty to Eastern authorities was suspect. Their fitness for citizenship was questionable, and even their degree of civilization was dubious. Even when outside help arrived in the form of reformers and industrialists in the late 1800s, Appalachians just seemed impervious to civilizing forces. Historian Arnold Toynbee, a very famous historian writing in the late 1930s, early 1940s, claimed that, quote, the modern Appalachian has gone downhill. In fact, the Appalachian mountain people today are no better than barbarians. They have relapsed into illiteracy and witchcraft. They suffer from poverty, squalor, and ill health. They are white barbarians, end quote. They were all the worse, he lamented, because they had tasted the civilization brought by outsiders and rejected it. 20 years later, viewing the poverty in Appalachia in the 1960s, scholar Jack Weller, in his famous book, Yesterday's People, concluded that, quote, the greatest challenge of Appalachia is its people. Weller argued that Appalachia, due to its isolation, was imprisoned by the past. Appalachians had failed to modernize and remained mired in backward tradition. Of course, there's a rediscovery of Appalachia in the national consciousness in the 1960s. Time magazine, Life magazine, other media outlets of the period frequently showcased poverty in Appalachia. And certainly Appalachia did have some poverty, but where the contention lies in what was the cause of the poverty. Unfortunately, Weller's book, which was a lengthy argument that Appalachians were to blame for their own poverty, was endorsed by academics, development agencies, and government officials for decades as the best study of Appalachia. It was followed by numerous studies agreeing that the people themselves were to blame for Appalachia's poverty. These studies shared the assumption that the poor have a particular personality and character that causes their impoverishment. And this way of thinking becomes known as the culture of poverty. For instance, proponents of this culture of poverty thesis often argued the Appalachians suffered from extreme pessimism, which they labeled fatalism, and therefore saw no need to pursue opportunity or improvement. This fatalism, they agreed, was a trait with frontier roots. Because the Appalachians had failed, well, because the scholars had failed to recognize the historic diversity of Appalachia, they assumed that the fatalism grew out of the Scots-Irish religious heritage and its Calvinism. They also blamed Appalachia's alleged isolation. So one of the most famous voices, or the loudest voices in this culture of poverty idea was a sociologist named Rupert Vance. Rupert Vance argued, quote, mountain isolation, which began as physical isolation enforced by rugged topography, became mental and cultural isolation, holding people in disadvantaged areas, resisting those changes that would bring them into contact with the outside world. The effect of conditions thus becomes a new cause of conditions, but the cause is now an attitude, not a mountain. In short, whereas mountains had once isolated Appalachia, Appalachians were now isolated from modernity by their backward attitudes and their character flaws. But the culture of poverty thesis failed to acknowledge that the behavior of poor Appalachians was actually adaptation to circumstance, not some inherent personality flaw. Proponents of this thesis had also interpreted Appalachians' refusal to cooperate with outsiders, or the rejection of outside help, as evidence of their backwardness, instead of seeing it as a form of resistance to arbitrary authority. Appalachian insistence on holding on to a traditional dialect, for example, was mistaken for ignorance rather than an act of rebellion. In earlier periods, critics and even scholars had mistaken Appalachian resistance to modern industrial work regimes as laziness, when their behavior was actually resistance to capitalism and the way it was reordering their traditional rhythms of life. What made the culture of poverty explanation so compelling in the mid-20th century were the images accompanying it. At the same time that these scholars were blaming Appalachians for their problems, America was rediscovering Appalachia. And what they discovered was that it was devastatingly poor. When JFK arrived in West Virginia during his 1960 presidential campaign, he found grinding poverty, even in Bramwell, a town that gained notoriety at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries for the wealth it reaped from coal. At one time, Bramwell was nicknamed home of the millionaires. This is Bramwell, West Virginia. The small town claimed 17 millionaires, the highest per capita population of wealthy people in the nation at that time. At the time of Kennedy's visit, however, These homes remained, but the prosperity had fled. JFK also toured McDowell County, the poorest county in West Virginia. He was so appalled that he promised to send help if he were elected president. And in fact, he made good on that promise. His first executive order created the modern food stamp program, whose first recipients were McDowell County residents. Because then going door to door and talking to these people, JFK had discovered that these people weren't poor because they had a character flaw. They were poor because all of the coal mines in the area had shut down and they didn't have anywhere else to go to work. The discovery of poverty in Appalachia continued to attract attention. One of the vehicles that exposed Americans to this poverty was a CBS special report by Charles Kuralt. It was called Christmas in Appalachia, and it's online, it's on YouTube if you want to watch it, and it's really it's a rather sympathetic portrait of Appalachians, but there's no real delving into what made the people poor. There's very little context, much like this photo essay by Life magazine. Very little context about the economic history or dynamics of the community. Very little discussion of how these people came to be poor. Instead, it's just a series of photos with very little text. The text that does appear is something like, quote, Appalachia is a junkyard. Another one of the captions for the photos, the people themselves are often disease-ridden and unschooled. Here's another one. Idleness is now their accepted way of life. So again, sources like this had very little explanation, very little context about what was happening in Appalachia. Just these captions. With such grinding poverty in the midst of plenty, President Lyndon Johnson made every effort to solve the Appalachian problem by including the region in his war on poverty. To solve the problem, Johnson and Congress waged a war of development. President Johnson traveled to Martin County, Kentucky, one of the poorest areas in the US at the time, to launch his war on poverty in April 1964. Alleviating poverty in Appalachia became the centerpiece of his war on poverty. The war on poverty included a $1 billion allocation to 11 Appalachian states for the development of highways and other development projects via the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. And that piece of legislation had broad bipartisan support in Congress. Both Republicans and Democrats rushed to vote in favor of that, which granted that $1 billion to Appalachia. The Economic Opportunity Act also created VISTA. This is probably a familiar term. VISTA stands for Volunteers in Service to America. This was first conceived of by Kennedy, who viewed it as a domestic Peace Corps type program. The idea was to place volunteers across the US to help fight poverty. In exchange for 1 year of work, VISTA workers would get a small stipend. They would be embedded in low-income communities and tasked with empowering local government, organizations, and the people to improve their communities on their own. The underlying assumption implicit in VISTA when it came to Appalachia was to change the culture, to erode that supposed culture of fatalism of the Appalachian people and empower them to act on their own behalf. Volunteers sometimes realized that local politicians however, were part of the problem rather than potential partners. Not because they suffered from fatalism, but because local authorities suffered from corruption. Not always, but that did emerge as a problem. For instance, after exposing corruption in Pike County, Kentucky, several Vista workers were arrested by the local sheriff and charged with sedition and treason and, quote, plotting the violent overthrow of Pike County, Kentucky. And that court case was not resolved until the 1980s. People spent a long time trying to clear their name as being guilty of sedition and treason. Most Vistas, however, did service work and helped empower locals by giving them confidence, organization, and the resources to help improve their communities. But the Vistas learned something too. They learned that Appalachians were not fatalistic and they didn't suffer from a culture of poverty. They found that many people were willing and eager to work for positive change. They didn't lack motivation. They lacked resources and they lacked power to fix the problems plaguing them. In this sense, Appalachia wasn't exceptional. And it wasn't a unique problem that needed to be solved. As if the broader society, money, power, and corruption had marginalized the vulnerable. Appalachia was America writ large. Vista wasn't the only attempt to solve the problem of Appalachia. We're back to the Appalachian Regional Commission. Part of that war on poverty that Johnson launched was the establishment of the ARC in 1965. And this was based on the idea that what Appalachia needed was what third world countries needed. It needed development. So emphasis was placed on infrastructure, especially highways, to encourage private investment. There was also a focus on job training and industrial site development. There was also initially some investment in public services like healthcare. Now, the ARC has evolved over the years. Now it's involved in many more projects besides just infrastructure development. And to date, the ARC has experienced tremendous success overall. There are 93 Appalachian counties that are currently considered economically distressed. That's down from 223 when the ARC was established in 1965. Studies show that earnings and incomes are higher, health outcomes overall are better, workers are more skilled, and the infrastructure has been modernized. Central Appalachia still lags behind. And in the early years, the war on poverty in general experienced tremendous success, cutting poverty in America by half. So why didn't the war on poverty end Appalachian poverty? Why do we still have 93 counties that are distressed? Some Americans, in a general national political backlash to an active big government, argued that because poverty still existed, it was proof that the government couldn't fix it. So they pushed to cut the programs and the funding, programs like the ARC. Few people argued that perhaps instead of too much government aid, perhaps the issue was that there wasn't enough. Other Americans argued that the culture of poverty just couldn't be solved, despite the fact that that culture of poverty idea has been completely discredited by scholars in the media, and in some political circles. You'll still hear that as given as a reason why Appalachia still struggles. And unfortunately, the debate on Appalachia and poverty has, for the most part, stalled right there, largely in part to the many persistent myths about Appalachia and its people. One of the most effective ways of controlling a people is controlling or distorting their history. And this has certainly been the case for Appalachia. The myths created by the distortion of history really do matter. They matter because they have power. The power to recast an entire group of people as ridiculous, cartoonish, or violent. Myths have the power to render legitimate complaints irrelevant. Misperceptions and stereotypes are also dangerous because they make it easier to deflect uncomfortable questions about who has money and power, who doesn't, and why. In the case of Appalachia, myths define poverty as a personality flaw, rather than a lack of access to resources and opportunities, or as the result of systemic persistent problems. Misperceptions about Appalachia create an atmosphere where Appalachians and their issues aren't taken seriously. And that's exactly the point of distorting history in manufacturing myths. Because if we really look for the truth, some change might have to occur, a change that might involve a redistribution of power and resources. So when we get Appalachian history wrong, or when we get any history wrong, it becomes too easy to embrace these myths, myths that dehumanize and demean whole groups of people. But when we get it right, we create the conditions necessary for positive change in Appalachia and America at large. Thank you.
Does anyone in the audience have a question for Dr. Keaton?
Yeah, I wonder if you could speak a little more to stereotypes in the media, maybe going back to Al Capp's Dog Patch and Lavender to rural sitcoms of the 60s.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that has been, that I didn't say in this, that have made these so powerful is because they weren't just in the local color, they end up seeping into TV and film and comic strips. And Appalachians, a lot of the times, embrace those stereotypes themselves. I mean, I'm just full confession, I love Granny on the Beverly Hillbillies. I'm sorry, she's great. And I think, and I'm not an expert on country music, but when that starts to emerge here, and you can correct me on this, it becomes first labeled as hillbilly music, and people were proud of that, and that was a good thing. So I think the fact that hillbilly and mountaineer has in some cases been degrading, but it's also been embraced and seen as a positive thing by some people, makes it even more tenacious in culture. And now it's, some people, if you call them a hillbilly, they'll say, yeah, yes, thank you. And some people will just get fighting mad.
I'll just add a fun anecdote about the hillbilly in music, because we're here at the Birthplace of Country Music Museum, but Ralph Peer, the producer who did the 1927 Bristol sessions, is the one who coined that term. When he recorded a group called the Hillbillies, they didn't have a name when he first recorded them, so he asked what they wanted to be called, and they said, well, we're just a bunch of hillbillies. So that's what he put on the paper, and that's how the term for that genre, hillbilly music, got started. Any other questions?
Hi, so I've got a question. It kind of can be broadly interpreted as a larger American immigration question. But so turning into the 20th century, this is when we see the birth of the modern corporation with the board of trustees. And this is, if I remember right, this is when you're pointing out, this is when ownership, control of resources is moving out of Appalachian hands. It's also when we see a massive spike in immigration into the area. Do we see those same industrialists encouraging immigration into the specific area because this is lower wages they have to pay?
Absolutely. Owners of these companies find that the pool of labor in Appalachia just isn't large enough. So they actively recruit immigrants to come. They'll pay for their transportation. They build company towns, somewhere to live. They do everything possible to encourage people just to get labor from anywhere that they can to move it. So it's a very purposeful endeavor by companies to recruit.
Do we have any Zoom questions, Tony? Oh, I think there's one up there too. I'll do it over here and then I'll come up to you, Jerry.
I've read that a whole lot of our early immigrants were done from Great Britain, were dumped out of their prisons and insane asylums, and so it's hard to expect a whole lot out of that kind of people.
There's a terrific book by, I believe the author is Nancy Eisenberg, and the title is White Trash. The early chapters of that book do an excellent job of explaining how Europe, especially Great Britain, viewed the colonies, especially North Carolina, in the beginning as what they called a sink. And the word sink is used frequently by Britons at the time throughout the 1700s as a place where the dregs of British society could be drained away. And that they're called dregs and waste. And at first there's a lot of talk about North Carolina being the place they're going to send those people. So that's who they actively try to get out of Great Britain. Criminals, people who were locked up in asylums, anybody that was, they deemed a threat to society. So it's a great book. It does a good job of describing that process. So.
I don't really know where to start. The Appalachia has been treated like a third world country forever, and the industrialists have encouraged the stereotypes and the whole stereotypical Appalachian, almost to the point of shame. And I just really like you to comment on the whole the swirls around the industrialization and extraction of Appalachia and the shame that these stereotypes are brought on. Yeah, can you comment on that, please?
Mm-hmm. There is, and I'll go back to that slide. I only used this one particular pamphlet as an example of a coal company actively trying to cast Appalachians as violent and ignorant and backward, and then casting themselves as, the reform, the saviors that Appalachians needed. They certainly weren't the only people doing things like this. There are newspapers, magazines, sometimes companies would go to local colleges and try to work with them and say, look, we know people here are in need of saving and civilization. So let's work with you. And part of that process was convincing the outside world that Appalachians needed help. So part of that convincing was casting Appalachians as, just almost feral. Like somebody needs to come in and save these people. So, many of the feuds, for example, that people pointed to at the turn of the century to try to cast Appalachians as really violent, they never happened, or they were blown way out of proportion. But there is a purposeful, concerted effort by industrialists, coal companies and timber companies, others, to do everything they could to make Appalachians look bad so that they could come in and easily manipulate them and take their resources. And that's unfortunate. And it's unfortunate it did not stop at the turn of the century. That's continued. One of the outcomes of the ARC promoting infrastructure and development is that by the 1970s, in some places, there's improved infrastructures and roads, and companies can get into Appalachia more easily. Unfortunately, some local politicians in Appalachia would sell their communities as a good place for companies to come because the people there were ignorant and backward and didn't have any other chances for jobs. So if you build a factory here, these people will work because they have nowhere else to go. They're easily controlled, and you'll have them over a barrel once you give them a job. So it's something that really started in earnest at the turn of the century, but didn't go away. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Were there any champions? Your assignment was a negative one, and you did a great job giving us all the evil things. JFK is no longer around with us. Lyndon Johnson is no longer. Who's left to be the spokesperson to tell the truth? If
There is. I don't know if anybody's listening to them, but so the inspiration for the title of this of my presentation was a book called "What You Are Getting Wrong About Appalachia" by Elizabeth Catt. Yeah, tremendous voice. There are also some organizations like Appalachian Voices. And I'm trying to think of some of the environmental organizations that have been really active around mountaintop removal. They're on the tip of my tongue. But there are still organizations and groups speaking out and working to say, hey, we're not all dumb hillbillies down here. And I think some people do that inadvertently. I mean, I think of all the colleges and universities in the area, they're great spokespeople for saying the good things happen here.
Or each one speaks individually.
There is an Appalachian College Association that does a great job of promoting education and development. There's also, trying to think of individuals, there's a great documentary was made a few years ago called Hillbilly. I forget the name of the person that made it, but she's emerged as kind of an activist for pro Appalachia, and it's a really good. That's Ashley York.
We showed it here at the museum last year, I think, during we had a Mountain Dew exhibit that talked a lot about hillbilly stereotypes used in their advertising, but I also can't remember who the director was right now.
So there are people out there speaking.
I'm getting the signal that we've got 2 online questions, but I told this woman that she could go next and then we'll go to them.
Yeah, so we've got a couple online questions. This one's from Tina McDaniel, and she says, what have been the implications of the internalization of these negative stereotypes from an economic standpoint?
Hmm. That is such a big question. I mean, it's definitely negative when you have an outsider say that Appalachians are backward and all of these other negative, have all these other negative attributes. It doesn't breed confidence in investors and people to want to come here and start businesses. But when Appalachians themselves look at themselves as backward or behind, or they embrace the stereotype of hillbilly, like I'm a hillbilly and I'm proud of it. I get that. I understand that. And there's some power in reclaiming and redefining that word. But one of the negative outcomes of doing that is that you're perpetuating all of the bad connotations that come with words like hillbilly. And that just reinforces that idea, and people don't want to come here. Another one that I see people internalize is, you know, we don't need no outsiders coming into Appalachia and telling us what to do. And again, I mean, I'm an Appalachian. I get that. And there's a little part of me that I don't want to let go of the surly Appalachian, but there's nothing inherently wrong in outsiders coming in that really do want to help. So I think sometimes people embrace that, trying to recast it as empowerment, but it has some really negative consequences. You're just perpetuating that this is a land of isolated, ignorant, backward hillbillies. And then that's not where people want to engage in economic development, or people end up voting against their own interests when they internalize some of these hillbilly stereotypes and ideas.
And then another question in the chat says, this is from Fred Barnstein. He says, many of my youngest college students in Ohio haven't even heard of the Appalachian stereotypes. Are there indications that their visibility might be waning in the internet era? And I think that'll probably be the last question, except I do have one after that. Okay.
Okay. I've got one too, and I have the mic, so.
That is a really good question, because like when I get to the end of this class, about week 13 or 14, we start to shift the discussion away from mountaineer and hillbilly into the territory of redneck. And do they overlap? Are they different? What is a redneck? So I think that's what has happened in popular culture, is that redneck has come to supplant the term hillbilly. But when you start to dig down, they have many of the same attributes. It's just the label has changed. So I would be fascinated to know what his students would think if he asked them, well, what is a redneck? And then run it against the list of what people assume a hillbilly is.
Do you want to ask your question?
Hillbilly that's willing to get to work.
I'll let you ask yours first, Tony.
Well, and mine's just kind of a wrap-up question. And I was just going to ask, what is your best advice for flipping the narrative on these stereotypes as far as people who live in this region and just speaking with people on the outside? Because I think that's something that a lot of us here that identify as Appalachian constantly deal with, is just fighting to say, hey, we aren't those stereotypes. We don't live up to that negativity. And it feels like a constant battle.
Absolutely. I went to an academic conference, I won't say where, about 10 years ago, and spent the week. Anytime I said something halfway intelligent, people oohed and awed, because like, oh, she has overcome her hillbilly come on and holler upraising or upbringing to say something smart. So I get that. I think the thing is just to keep saying what you're saying is we're not all backward and dumb. And, you know, I always tell students, if you leave any of my classes, no matter whether it's about the Middle East or Appalachia or whatever, that your attitude toward the subject should be, it's complicated. You know, you should never leave a class on colonial America saying this country was founded on tax. You should never leave, you know, a class on the Middle East saying this group of people is bad. You should have the attitude, it's complicated. I mean, there are poor people in Appalachia. There are areas of where we need improvements in education. Appalachia does have some problems, but that shouldn't define the region. It's complicated, it's complex. It's just like anywhere else in America. The American West has problems, you know, that aren't just restricted to Appalachia. So I would just encourage people to think, you know, not in these black and white terms, but that it's very complex and complicated.
And I also just remembered that I had promised you an opportunity to give your comment if you want to.
So my comment was just that I grew up born in the 60s, you know, so I grew up here in Appalachia and was in education, you know, in the 70s, where my teachers kept saying they had internalized that Appalachia was bad and kept saying things like, you're too smart. You got to get out of here, move away from here. And that's what students unfortunately heard a lot. I hope that's no longer going on, but it is, unfortunately, too. And that to me is one of the biggest, probably one of the biggest side effects of the war on poverty from the 60s, was convincing our own people that this area was bad. So that was just my comment.
You know, brain drain is still a very persistent problem. And since we're at the, you know, a country music museum, I guess the best response to that would be, you know, what you're saying is immortalized in that song, Reading, Writing, and Route 23. Or is it 23? Yeah. 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 I still see that happening. People being encouraged to leave.
All right, well, as Tony mentioned, we are running a little late on time, so I'll ask one final question here that will transition us into my reminder of our other upcoming programs, because my question ties in your talk to our current special exhibit, which is I've Endured Women in Old Time Music. And one of the things that we discuss in that exhibit is the difference in perspective between male and female writers talking about the same thing. And I know that also shows up in the early folklorists who were collecting songs in this region and the way that they talked about the region in their annotations. And Emma Bell Miles was the first one to publish an article in Harper's Weekly about, or Harper's Monthly, about music in Appalachia, and her article is pretty positive. So I wondered, have you noticed a trend in the way that men versus women talk about the region in their writings?
As far as like the local color writers at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, a lot of those aren't female writers, but the ones that are usually work in somewhere something about handicrafts, like quilts, or what women do. The males that are writing usually have that portrayal of, well, the women are just hanging around being lazy and do nothing. But the few female writers usually always have something to say about the women sewing clothes, that they're working, a lot of the things that they're doing around the home. And it was really interesting about that is that regardless of whether the writer is male or female, one of the persistent criticisms of Appalachians are that the women just work like men. Like they're out in the fields and they're, they just do the same thing that men do. And, this is the turn of the century. height of American Victorian culture. Women are supposed to aspire to this middle class existence where you stay in the home and you're very domestic. And people are horrified that these women in Appalachia, oh my goodness, they'll get out and they'll chop wood like that. That can't be happening. So,
Well, thank you so much. This was a wonderful talk.
thank you.
So as I mentioned, our current special exhibit here at the museum is called I've Endured Women in Old Time Music. It's on display now through the end of the year. So if you haven't had a chance to see it yet, be sure to check that out. I've got a couple other upcoming programs I want to tell you about, and then we'll let you all go home for the evening. We confirmed today that our next speaker sessions will be with Brian Pierce from the National Museum of African American Music in Nashville, Tennessee. We'll have more information about this posted online soon, so keep an eye out for that. We also have on Monday, July 17th and Tuesday, July 18th, a teacher in-service workshop. So if you have any teachers or educators in your family or friend group, please let them know it is free to attend. The lunch is included, and we'll have all sorts of programming and discussion with them about the educational resources that we have at the museum that we can offer them to take into their classrooms. And then also on Saturday, July 22nd, from 2 to 5 o'clock is our monthly Bluegrass Jam. So if you want to come jam with us, you can head on down and bring your instruments with you. We do not have instruments for that. If you do not play and you just want to hang out and listen, you're also welcome to come and observe. So thank you all for coming out tonight and have a wonderful evening.